Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet, brought to you by Anarchapulco, the world's largest anarcho-capitalist conference, being held this February 19th to 21st, 2016, right here in Acapulco, Mexico. I have a guest coming in from the Great White North. It's about minus 15 Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it doesn't really matter at that point. It's Steve Moloney. He's an author. He's also very involved in trying to wake up people to libertarianism and also trying to help people with just wake up their own awareness to themselves, a topic that we've been getting into quite a bit lately. He also, interestingly, sort of came to some of this through what they call the free man on the land movement or sovereign citizen movement, and that's something we haven't really talked about at all on Anarchast. So that's something that we'll get into a little bit as well. So before we get started, Steve, I got to ask you, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, Jeff, I think I've always been an anarchist, if that terminology is to be used. I think it's a natural thing for most people. It's just whether they're exposed to it early on or have an opportunity to think about it. I don't know what it is that switches people on. I think that every animal, every sentient being, if you go poking a stick at it, it somehow cringes. It wants to get away. It wants to have its own comfort without being dictated by other people. And believe it or not, I never actually learned how to read until I was an adult, based on perhaps a learning disability and also terrible government schools. So, and I grew up in an area, a very remote area, so that we didn't have television, we didn't have internet, we had lots of books, but I couldn't read. So I became more of a thinker. And I thought a lot about things, and I thought about things from a very early age in a rational sense. Things had to add up. And I remember years ago, before I was introduced to any of this sort of thing, I remember talking to people 10, 20 years ago saying, taxation has got to be theft. It has to be. Because if I didn't say that you could take that, but you come and take it anyway, it's theft. And I'd always get the same argument, yeah, well, but who's going to pay for this and who's going to pay for that? And I'd kind of say, well, it doesn't really matter. I didn't give anybody permission to come and take $10,000 from me. So that, in any other definition, is theft. So this was a long time ago. And I was frustrated because I felt that I was in a sort of a temporal hell that I couldn't get out of. So I actually hatched this amazing scheme, which I almost followed through with in the early 90s, before I even heard of Detax Canada. And it was to fake my own death. It was that bad. Because I knew of this guy who told me of a buddy of his who had hippie parents. This kid was born in the bush somewhere, was never registered.
So wait just one sec before we get going here. So you just sort of were looking at things and you sort of realized taxation is theft, and then you said, that's it, I'm going to fake my own death?
Yeah, because I realized that at the time I said there's no way out of it. But I realized that if I had no identity, they'd have nothing to steal. They'd have no entity to steal from. Because this.
So you didn't waste any time at all? Like, you realized taxation is theft, and then pretty much the next day you said, you're going to fake your own death? Or was this like a long period of time?
No, it was pretty quick, because this guy that I knew had told me about a buddy of his who was born of hippie parents in the bush somewhere, and he had no ID, so nobody could touch him. He was driving one time even, and he got pulled over, and they didn't know who he was, they couldn't charge anybody. They just basically let him go. I thought, gee, that's a way out. If I fake my death, and I was living in Vancouver at the time, I thought if I walk over the mountains and just disappear, and after the search parties go away and so many months, they're dead, and then I just come back. I'm a dead man walking. I'm free. But I didn't go through with it because I realized it would just put my family through hell. So I didn't do it, and so that went on. So I just lived in this.
I like how seriously actually we're thinking of doing it, like so quickly after realizing taxation is theft. You came up with this whole plan, and then you kind of were like, well, that's going to probably put my family through quite a bit of emotional pain, thinking I'm dead for a while, so I'm not going to do it. That's pretty funny. I like it.
Yeah, and I've never actually told anybody this in a public forum. It's kind of odd. This just kind of came to me. It's not in one of my books or anything. But it's what actually happened. I remember scheming it for a while, and I thought, well, maybe I'll actually die in the process too, living through the mountains. But I never actually did anything else until I actually was on the West Coast, and I moved to the prairies. I bought this land for the reason that I wanted to get out of this stranglehold of intensive urbanization and just mind control that was going on. I thought if I live in the middle of nowhere, then I'll be free. But the rural municipality just came after me with a vengeance. They threw all these new ordinances and said that I had to have building permits and all. And I'd ask them questions, you know, like, do you own my land? And I still didn't know anything at the time, but I had to add up. I said, if you don't own my land, then how can you tell me what to do on my land? See, I can understand in a city where houses were 4 feet apart or something, that if one guy's house catches on fire, okay, the next guy's house might catch on fire. But where I was living, I was 4 miles from anybody. So why do I have to have a certain sump pump in my basement? Like, it didn't, just nothing made sense. And these guys, I couldn't get it across to them.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It doesn't make any sense. So you were actually just rational and logical. Same as when you first realized taxes were theft. You immediately were like, yeah, taxes are theft. And then you came up with your whole big plan to fake your own death, which would have been kind of funny, too, because if the government sent search teams out looking for you, they'd be using tax dollars to look for you as you fake your own death to avoid taxes, which is that would be extra icing on the cake on that one. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, so the last point I'm going to make is that when this rural municipality came after me, I was back to where I was again. I guess I have to submit to these guys. So, but then I was watching a video that somebody sent me about something else, and I think it was a guy named Dean Ornish. He's a physician in LA or something, and he was talking about something else in this video, and he happened to mention these freedom movement people in England. So I immediately Googled freedom people in England, and I found I entered a new world, Jeff. I kid you not. All of a sudden I found people like Robert Menard, free man on the land, with all these videos about how there's a legal person and all that, and wow. And then I found Dean Clifford. He was ranting and raving and spent time in jail just for, you know, standing up for himself. And I found Larkin Rose through him. I found Mark Stevens. I found Larsander Spooner. I found rediscovered Doug Casey. I knew about Doug Casey way back in the early 90s through some real estate thing I did, but I didn't know he was this kind of an anarchist guy. And I found Steve Moloney. And I'll tell you, my life changed, my family changed, because some of my kids got onto this thing. And it has been, I realize that now that there's no legitimacy for government. There is no government, it's just men and women with guns. And they hide behind ropes and so on. And I actually ended up in court at one point too, which I learned a lot from. And
So did you kind of do this free man on the land thing? And before you answer that question too, was that you that introduced me to Dean Clifford recently?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so apparently he might be coming on Anarchast, and he mentioned Larkin Rose, Stefan Molyneux, Mark Stevens. So those are all past Anarchast guests. Doug Casey as well. Of course, Lysander Spooner was a little pre-internet when he was around, but a lot of the people we've had on Anarchast, so that's great. So I'm looking forward to having Dean on, because he's fairly well known in this movement. Why don't you tell us, if you did get involved in that movement, how it worked out?
Well, my involvement in it was basically just learning about it. I've never gone to any events. I have visited Dean Clifford a few times because he was in jail for 16 months. He just got out in the spring. And 3 or 4 of those months he was in solitary confinement and never convicted of anything as far as I know. But they just locked him up in a remote jail, and nobody could visit him either, because most of the people who know him have got all kinds of citations and what have you against them for driving without driver's licenses and so on. And also they made all these new rules for Dean Clifford. They made it such that almost nobody, the Howard Johnson Society, or the Johnson something society, who's supposed to be, I forget what they're called now, John Howard Society, who's supposed to be able to help out prisoners, they wouldn't even touch him. Because I had inquired about them and they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't want anything to do with Dean Clifford. But I had a heck of a time visiting him. So that was my involvement, really, was trying to learn about it. And that's the page I landed on, if you will. If there's many different pages on this whole freedom movement, like you're into the financial side of it and so on, so is Doug Casey, and political diversification and so on. But the free men on the land, it's a term that the legal system has jumped onto. And basically they've called them terrorists. So it's a big name out there, but I wouldn't say I was in the movement. It was the page that I landed on when I was looking. and I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, we're all terrorists now. Apparently, the U.S. government just recently said they're going to stop going after ISIS. Luke Rudowski, past Anarchast guest, had a great video on this. They're going to stop going after ISIS, which actually is Dick Cheney's crew of rabble-rousers and government overthrowers and true terrorists. And they're going to go after people in America who are anti-government now. And I don't know why anyone would be pro-government, the pro-violence, pro-theft, pro-war, but there's a lot of them, and us people who are against and don't do anything. We don't. We had so many of our past Anarchast guests who have been in solitary confinement, as you brought up. Adam Kokesh, of course, Ross Ulbricht of Silk Road. He wasn't a past Anarchast guest, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because I'd be on more radars if he was. He was in solitary for a while. Now he's in life in prison for creating a website. That's all he did. And you pointed out Dean Clifford. I'm hoping he's going to come on because I really want to get more into the details of what he's been doing and find out that it's just interesting. He was in solitary confinement and more than a year in a cage because he pointed out some legalities that the government didn't want people to know about. And so, yeah, we're the new terrorists. We're the nicest, most peaceful people I know, really, and we're the new terrorists.
Well, it was interesting, actually, with Dean Clifford, because they had made new rules for him because they didn't want anybody to see him. His own family couldn't go visit him, couldn't call him for months at a time. And you still there?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, something happened on my screen. And they gave me the runaround too. They couldn't really legally stop me from visiting him because I followed all the rules, and I didn't have any charges against me or anything at the time. But I'm Saskatoon. He was down in Brandon. I went all the way there after having been in contact with them that it was okay for me to come to visit them, kind of thing. I go all the way there, they wouldn't let me visit him because it was some sort of technicality that there's brand new visitation changes had happened. And I talked to Dean later, and yeah, they made them because of him. And then the second time I went, they tried everything they could, which was that they all of a sudden said, oh, you got to have 3 pieces of ID or something, and thinking that nobody carries that many pieces of ID, right? And I had the 3. One of them was my passport. They wouldn't accept my passport because they didn't like the way I signed it. My signature went outside the line or something. They said, you've altered your passport. This is how crazy they were. But fortunately, I had, and I carry it when I travel sometimes, an affidavit of identity stamped by a notary public, fresh, and my record of live birth. I went out and I said, okay, I've got one more piece. I went out to the car and I got that. And they didn't know what to do. They were walking around in their jail, sort of like behind their bulletproof glass, scratching their head, and they said, yeah, I guess you can go in and see them. But they stripped me of everything. They wouldn't let me go in there with anything. It was through bulletproof glass that we talked. So
yeah, because you both wanted to kill each other, obviously.
Yeah, and it was controlled. Like there's no such thing as one-on-one visitations, and it was really, really a shame because he was in there for what they call a victimless crime, but they put him next door in solitary confinement with that guy who had butchered people on the way through Manitoba or something, like with violent criminals who are completely psychotic and so on, to try to break him down,
Yeah, political refugee essentially put into a total heinous torture dungeon, essentially is what it is, because he's pointing out things about freedom. That just goes to show how these governments are getting, even in Canada. A lot of people think Canada's a great place, but David Icke isn't allowed to go to Canada. Luke Rudowski's banned from Canada. I don't think I'm banned yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if I am.
They won't ban you, though. It'd be very difficult for them to ban you because my understanding is you were born up in the Great White North.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to go up there anyway. It's too cold. But it just goes to show, like, a lot of people think this, we're just some guys talk about freedom and stuff. And no, they're actually coming after a lot of us. And, I don't think it should be a reason that anyone backs down or hides or anything. I think as soon as any of us do that, including just any regular person out there, we start to lose. The whole thing is that we have to stay and stand for our right, that our principles principle that we believe that we own ourselves and that we've never given our consent to be owned by anyone else, and that it includes government. It's just crazy to hear that about Dean, that it took you that much just to be able to even talk to him while he was in solitary confinement or next to like a guy who cut heads off of people in a Greyhound bus, if that was the same guy.
Yeah,
and
somebody like that. I don't know exactly sure, but when you talk to him, you'll get more details.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a crazy story. So, yeah. Anything else you want to talk about Man on the Land or anything like that?
Well, as far as the free man on the land goes, what I learned about there was the difference between. It was a lot of legalisms I found, and it helped me to, which I think this is the most important. It helped me to wake up to more self-knowledge of what I am, because there's this whole bait and switch program that goes on, which is that when we're born, our mother usually fills out this form and signs it and saying, a baby boy was born on this day. And then the name is given, and that's sent in, that's kept on file. That's the real identity. And then what's sent back is the birth certificate, and that's when it all begins, the whole fraud, because the birth certificate is not a representation of us. So that's the main thing I learned through the free men on the land, if you will, guys like Robert Menard, Dean Clifford, and what have you. But it was just the beginning of my journey of what I consider to be the most important, which is free knowledge, or rather, not free knowledge, but self-knowledge, and coming out of the delusions and the psychosis of believing in things that don't exist, like borders, for example.
Or governments, as Larkin Rose has written his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. Government really is just superstition. It's an idea. It doesn't actually really exist. It's just things that people believe in.
That's right. I remember one time when I was living in what's called Southern Ontario, Windsor. It's right across the river from Detroit. And I was talking to somebody, I was asking him, where is the border actually? He said, well, it's in the middle of the river. And I said, well, can you show it to me? Can we go out with a boat and actually see that border? Well, no, but it's there. So can we actually take a piece of that water and bring it to a lab, and they'll say, yup, there's some border in there. No, but the belief is so strong that it's almost as real as the river is. And this to me is a psychosis. I mean, based on the definition of a psychosis, I just looked it up not long ago, it's loss of contact with reality. Because it doesn't actually exist. But people act and believe and will defend it to the death with guns that it exists. This is a prime example of a psychosis. And to me, I'm still working my way out of these, because I lapse back into it once in a while and say, well, I just crossed the border. No, I just passed a sack of bandits who could shoot me if I didn't do what they said. That's what I really passed. And it's, I remember I forget who once it said, it might have been Lysander Spooner, who said that a border is a place where two sets of warlords decided to stop fighting. And it's interesting to go down to the Canadian-US border, so-called. That's what you have people with guns on one side and people with guns on the other side, and they've agreed to let these slaves go back and forth as long as they have the right documentation across this invisible line. That's all it is. And at first I was angry about it. And then I realized, well, it's just...
You didn't think to fake your own death over that one too, did you?
Well, no, that only happened to me once. That was in my early days. It was just so frustrating because I thought I was alone. And that's the other thing that was so nice about waking up and just running into so many people who are thinking something the same. Like even here in Saskatoon, I host these events, these coffee chat events, and I've met so many people who are outside the box thinkers. And I can actually talk to somebody now. For a while I was like, I'm living on an island. I look at something, say something, look at me like, you're messed up.
Yeah, when you talk to a lot of your average person, especially up there in Canada or the U.S., they're brainwashed. You called it psychosis. It's the same thing. Their head is filled with beliefs that aren't really true, and when you tell them something that is more true, they think you're crazy. That's how brainwashing or psychosis and all these things work. Interesting thing about Saskatoon, I was there a couple of years ago for a conference, and actually it's kind of a nice little town, I have to say.
We enjoy it here.
Yeah, I was nicely surprised. I'd never been there before, except for as a child. I didn't remember it. And it was quite a nice little town. I actually had a pretty good time. We hung out with a lot of people. And one of the people that we hung out with was a Native American man. I forget his name at the moment. But I always enjoy meeting Native Americans, almost always. I was just up in Edmonton, actually. I was just playing some poker, and there's always some Native Americans in the casino. I always enjoy talking to them. And especially with this one time in Saskatoon, he was a total entrepreneur. He was a total hustler. He was just finding ways around government every way possible. I think he was selling what do you call it, untaxed cigarettes from the the reserve. I was wondering if you had any of that sort of experience up there. There's quite a bit of a native population there.
Yeah, not a lot really. Although I have run into some people. I know of one guy who runs what they call a First Nations business, and they run, as far as I know, tax-free, and it's good. It's refreshing because Native people who are thinkers, who are not just right on the dole, because many of them are, because that's the whole point of it, is they wanted to get these people, they wanted to bring these people under the crown, and that's one of the reasons I think they weren't actually persons when they came. I have a lot of thought into this. I think that, I don't know if it makes sense or not, but they tried to bring them in, so they've dumbed down and they've really destroyed the people. But there's some that are starting to spring up and say, well, actually, I never gave my consent to the crown to govern me, and therefore I'm just going to operate. And they have some advantages because they can be tax-free. They don't need a passport to go to the United States. They can basically operate without identification as we know it. So they're a shining light, and I think there's a great opportunity. For example, I forget the name of the band now in northern Saskatchewan. It's just across from Lloydminster, across from they have a lot of oil wealth, and they have recently cut off contact with Ottawa and say, we don't need your welfare and everything. We're a nation, and if you want to, contact us,
that's great.
If you want to contact us, come here and set up an embassy, and that's how they're running it. And that band, I know a guy who's involved. They're running a series of seminars all across northern Saskatchewan, and I've asked them if I could go on some of them. They tend to be kind of closed to the natives, but they are teaching other bands how to be self-sufficient, how to be nations. And
that's great.
And most of them are dual citizens. That's what they say. We're dual citizens. We have citizenship of Canada if we want it, but we have our citizenship. And sorry, we don't need your police and so on. We'll take care of ourselves. And there is precedence for that. In my very early years, I was on Manitoulin Island in northern Ontario, and there is the unceded reservation. I think it's the only one in the so-called Canada. It's called Wikwimiquam. You can look it up, or the wiki.
Not that I can spell it.
Yeah, you just write in wiki, W-I-K-I, reserve in Manitoulin Island or something like that. And they are an unceded reservation, which means that the Crown, because they were in so remote of an area, the Crown never laid claim to their nation. So to this day, you go up there. I worked up there last year, and the island is about 1/3 native or 1/4 native, and the rest, everybody else. And to go over to the reserve is kind of like going to a different country in a way, because there's no HST, there's a lot less regulation, and they have a store there where you can buy big screen TVs, tax-free and whatever, anybody, because it's not Canada. They've made it very clear this is not Canada. We run our own show, and if you want to come here, our CMP, you better ask, or you're foreign invaders. And it's happened before where the OPP actually were thrown in jail for coming onto their land and trying to catch poachers and so on. And
that's awesome.
So this is starting to happen. The natives are re-exerting themselves, and I think it's wonderful to see. In British Columbia, so-called British Columbia, there's all sorts of native peoples. I know somebody that I know. He's trying to help Haida Gwaii, for example, to become a free and sovereign nation, independent completely of Canada, because that way they can run their own affairs, and no more of this crown tyranny.
That's great. If you know any of these Native Americans who consider themselves to be anarchists that are doing these things, please let me know. I'd like to have them on. But as
I'll
always,
probably get somebody around. I know a guy who has contact with a lot of them. I will do what I can.
yeah, and we always support more and more governments. That's the thing. We want 7 billion governments eventually. So when I hear about people breaking off from big governments and creating at least smaller governments, I always support that. So and like I said, I really like in general the Native Indian community, their culture, their style, and how they are. And so if there's some way I can get involved in that, I'd like to become a citizen of one of their new countries there if I can as well, especially if it is tax-free.
Ask Dean Clifford about that when he comes on, because he's in contact with some natives actually who formed their own nation. They're recognized by the UN, as far as I know, the last I talked to him. And he also knows a lot of natives, being in Manitoba, which maybe even has as many or more than Saskatchewan. And when he was in jail, it's mostly Native Americans, but that's who they jail, right? That's the vast majority of natives in anywhere you go are prisoners are natives, just like in the States it's mostly blacks.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing. They've been trying to destroy that culture for centuries. They used to, the royal family used to come and rape and kill all the kids, actually, and that was all the native kids. And then, one of the ways to destroy an entire culture or society is to put them all on welfare. And that's sort of similar in the U.S. with the many blacks, not all, but many, especially over past decades. That's how they've been trying to destroy them, is put them all onto welfare. That's the quickest way to destroy an entire culture. And so I'm glad to hear that the natives, as well as even the black people in the U.S. are really getting out of this state sort of control and ownership and destruction to some extent. So I totally support that.
Well, it's interesting to see how the con job that was done by the so-called American Revolution of freeing the slaves, where actually, from my understanding, is they made everybody a slave. It was.
Yeah, absolutely.
They didn't actually free the slaves. And people are starting to get wind of this, and they're starting to realize that. And one of the things I think that happened with the natives, one of the troubles that the Crown had with the natives, was that they didn't have them. See, because if you anywhere now, if Mexico, anywhere it is, if you don't have identification, there's always a threesome that they come up with. It has to be name, address, date of birth. Or at one time it was man, Christian, landowner, whatever. They gotta have three things. It's like the Holy Trinity runs through so many things. The most stable, the only minimum number of legs you need on a chair are three. To make dimensionality, you gotta have height, width, and thickness, and so on. There's this threesome that goes on throughout. And when they came here, there's all these people here, but they had nothing. They couldn't identify them any more than they could identify a deer, but they knew they had to. So they had to give them all kinds of shit to get them to sign over. Like, I remember reading a story one time about the Eskimos, about how they go up there, these census people, these roundup people, these, Gestapo, writers, and they go up there and they say, well, what's your name? Like, my name is Nook. Well, Nook who? Like, they need to have a first name and a last name. They got to have all this stuff, or they've got nothing and they can't touch them. So they've had to give them all this stuff. Oh, we'll give you a free house. But you gotta agree that this is your name, and now this is your post office address. This is your post in the local fort. Now you're a soldier. And this is your date of birth. It doesn't matter if it's the right date of birth. This is your date of birth. Once we got those three, we got you. And you agree to it, you sign it, and we'll send you back a card that says this identifies you. But it doesn't identify you. It identifies you as a file in their corporate structure. It's just a corporate franchise is all it is. And this is what I think has happened with the natives. It was more than just, let's brutalize these guys. It was, we got a problem here. We got some free people, and we got to take that freedom away. And we got to do whatever we can to make sure at the time that they are Christians. That's why the Christian mission, that was one of the pillars that it had to be. that they are two other things. And now, of course, it's date of birth, name, and address. If you don't have all three, you're free.
Somewhat.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's harder for them to touch it. So they just make you a ward of the state and then make the jail the address.
Yeah, but you brought up a good point that America never did end slavery. They just made everyone a slave, and now people in the U.S. cheer about it and are proud of it. It's insanity, but that's the world we live in, and I understand why you would want to fake your own death living in this world. But we should wrap this up a little bit. If you have anything else that you wanted to get into, let us know. I also know that you're going to be coming down and speaking at Anarchapulco, which is great. We have so many great speakers, so many great events. If you don't know about it, just check it out, anarchapulco.com, February 19th to 21st. We're also going to have all kinds of workshops. We have on the February 17th an entrepreneurship workshop. February 18th is the Dollar Vigilante Internationalization and Investment Summit. Also on the 18th is Luke Rudowski's We Are Change Media University. On the 19th is the beginning of the conference. On the 21st in the evening is an ayahuasca ceremony. On the 22nd is a peaceful parenting and unschooling workshop, as well as essentially a dating workshop. So a full roster of things if you want to come down to the beach of Mexico and learn some stuff, hang out, meet some really interesting people, and find out about really interesting and amazing ideas of things, people that are doing things. So why don't you let us know, Steve, anything else you want to finish up with, and we'll end it there.
Well, first of all, I want to give you a thumbs up, Jeff, for putting out an event like that and doing what you do. I mean, I consider you to be part of the worldwide wellness healing process. You know, when you talk about peaceful parenting and you talk about relationships, these sort of things are core, because if we love each other and we say we can call each other brothers and sisters and friends, we'll no longer want to steal from each other and beat each other up and damage each other. That spirit of cooperation and friendship is so important, and I salute you for that. The one thing I do want to mention, and I haven't mentioned this anywhere in a public forum yet, is I'm actually going on a freedom walk starting in the beginning, early March. I'm going to start walking on the west coast of North America, and I'm going to keep walking until my legs give out or I get to the east coast of North America, and I want to do a talk and engage as many people as possible about the concept of freedom and about the concept of fellowship and human friendship and so on. And let's get talking about ideas that help to improve the quality of our life experiences.
Wow, that's very interesting. I didn't know about that. If you are going to be walking across Canada, we have something called the Dollar Vigilante groups, and we have these groups all over the world. They're almost all libertarian or anarchists, and they're very on the same wavelength as we are, and we have a number in Canada. So I'm going to get you hooked up on those groups. For anyone watching, if you're in anywhere really, actually, Canada, the US, or pretty much anywhere in the world, if you're an anarchist and you want to be added to those groups, so when people like Steve are walking through your town or coming to visit or might want to move where you live, they can contact you and have a good base. Just send an email. I believe the email is Luis Fernando Mises, who is actually the host of Anarchast Espanol. He'll also be at Anarchapulco, so you can meet him there, Steve. I believe the email, I'll put it in the links down below. I believe it's lfernando@dollarvigilante.com. And so if you want to have your own group, first go to tdvgroups.com and see if there already is a group. If there is, we'll add you into it. If there isn't, you can start your own. We have, I think, around 100 already around the world. So for you, Steve, if you're going to be walking, and I don't know if this is all part of your plan to fake your own death, but if you're going to be walking across Canada, we'll definitely try to connect you with as many groups as possible, and hopefully people will write in on this if they're in different parts of Canada, so you can have different groups you can meet up with all along your walk.
Absolutely, and I welcome anybody out there to contact me anytime, and I'm more than willing to give a presentation or to share ideas anywhere that I am. That's what I do. I tend to do about 1 or 2 public presentations a week currently here in Saskatoon and area, or depending where I am, and that's, to me, that there's nothing more important than getting the message out and trying to connect with people on a deep level rather than a superficial level. Because once again, if we care for each other, and even if it's just a portion of humanity, a small portion of humanity, we start to create our own community, which is not necessarily boundary dictated. It's all over the world. We can come together in forums like this and in presentations of any kind and make a huge difference. It will make a difference. Putting this word out is so important. But by all means, if you can send me a link or something like that Jeff, and I will look up any groups like that as I go along and present myself, for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have a name for the walk, or can I have a website or anything where people can follow you, or a blog or anything like that?
I don't have one set up yet, although I hang out on Facebook a fair bit, and that's just Steve Moloney, Steve, and then Moloney. That's the easiest place to get a hold of me. Also, coffeechat.webs.com. That's a blog site that I run where I put videos up, and you can also find me on YouTube at flatbellyfeeling.com. That's where I post a video per day typically on my thoughts. And I'll be doing that when I'm on the walk as well.
Oh, great. So we'll put the links to all that down below so you can follow him if you're up in Canada. Please offer Steve a place that he can sit down and have a chat along the way. And he also, before he does that walk, he'll be at Anarchapulco. So you might want to come down and check that out as well. So as I mentioned, that's February 19th to 21st here in Acapulco, Mexico. And so check out the website, anarchapulco.com. Tons of great speakers, including people that Steve already mentioned, including people like Larkin Rose, Adam Kokesh, many, many others. Walter Block is one of our latest additions, and we've got we just added Ken O'Keefe, and he'll be on Anarchast either before or after this episode, I believe. So he's a big name as well. So it's going to be great down here in Acapulco, Mexico. It'll be a nice retreat from you from Saskatoon in the middle of winter before you do your walk, and look forward to seeing you down here. So if you like this video, like, subscribe, share down below. That's how we can spread these messages. Also check out Steve's websites and his Facebook and everything, and spread his messages, his videos on YouTube. And that's it for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
Because these bastards have no power but that which we give them. We've given them that power, and we've allowed them to run roughshod over the world. We've allowed millions of people's lives to be destroyed, and I don't give a shit what anybody wants to say. I have no interest in political correctness. We are directly responsible for that bullshit, and this is why we must stop it. No one else is coming in to save us. There is no fucking savior. We have to change this circumstance. So I say it because I don't believe we have any chance of handing over this world to our children and future generations in a better state unless we take responsibility.
In 1972, I watched my cousin, who was 25 at the time, die a horrible death from cancer. And then about 3 years later, when I was leaving, I worked at a hospital, and when I was leaving work that day, there was an announcement come on the radio. The announcer was laughing like a fool, but he was stating that a research study that had been done in the U.S. had proved that THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, which I prefer to call cannabis, had been found to kill cancer cells.
From Acapulco, Mexico, this is Anarchast.